Welcome back to another web development podcast episode where we help aspiring developers get jobs and junior developers grow. In this episode, we're going to be talking about why a user-centered developer is so hireable and so marketable. And I actually brought on a technical founder that has the mindset that's really going to explain why this works so well and what kind of engineers that he looks for. But yeah, I'm glad we finally get to have this conversation. Surya, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, Don. Thanks for having me. And I'm Surya. I'm the founder of Argonaut. And I started my career a little while ago, over a decade ago. I started off at Microsoft working on Bing ads. And I was working on like pricing ads, predicting the probability with which users would click on ads and stuff like that, right? This involved really large scale optimization, machine learning, and that kind of stuff. And then it was also an extremely fast-paced environment, lots of user feedback and A/B tests and experiments that were being run every day. That was pretty cool. And then after that, I moved to like a very different domain, but primarily, what I wanted to do was get to startups where I could take more ownership, and I love that responsibility that startups afford you, right? This was in an electric scooter company where I was leading the software and hardware pieces for pretty much the entire product. And after that, I moved on to a couple of other companies, increasingly smaller in size, as I like to say, smaller startups, basically building for the enterprise software market. And these were essentially AI startups in the retail and HR tech space. After that, I decided to go even smaller and started off with a company of one. And I'm building Argonaut now.
Okay, love it. Yeah, we're going to dive more into that as well. Just kind of, feel free to share whatever context you think is necessary, whether it's kind of from the roots of your company or not. But I really want to dig into, first of all, what is a user-centered developer? Why does that matter? What does it mean? Why do you seek out developers that are a little bit more user-focused? Because there are a lot of different personalities and different types of developers. And I think ultimately people just want to know, what can make them stand out? And we're going to talk about what can make them stand out to you. So let's actually start off with this. When you're hiring developers, what do you look for?
That's actually a very great question. So, something that we really care about in our hiring process is a fit in terms of the principles and in terms of the values that we have as a team, right? And something that is extremely important for all startups, and even more so in the case of Argonaut, is that we run lean, right? Now, that means that there are as a company, there are a lot of things to be done. And our approach is, generally speaking, is to get folks and get them and trust them with the responsibility and have them do the right thing instead of putting process and spending time verifying work and micromanagement and all of that, right? So that also has a very interesting side effect in that the people who are working on the particular problem, they love what they do because they see a direct impact of what they're doing towards the output, and as opposed to something like something that is unfortunately very common in larger companies, which is feeling like a cog in the wheel of a very large problem, right? You're essentially touching a very large part of what is being built at when you're working in a smaller company. Now, with that context, something that we really care about is making sure that people also build the right thing, because it's extremely important for a startup to be very focused on delivering the right kind of value to the users, right? Now, for that, a couple of things are super important. The first is high ownership. We get folks, and we sort of actually rather rudely push them out into the deep end, and try to get them to figure out how to expand their sphere of influence, right? And the way that looks like is, even when we have like people who are just starting off in their career, etc., join us, what we do is essentially scope out a large problem. This could be something like, hey, today we have support for AWS and GCP in our product. Go add Azure to it, right? It's a fairly large problem to solve for, but it also has the very nice advantage of getting people to expand their horizons, get comfortable with the fact that they need to be upskilling, and the value that we get as the rest of the team is that folks do their own research. They can get to the right kind of solution very easily. Now, that also requires first principles thinking and a deep understanding of the domain, and that's something that they can develop over time as well. Now, as you can imagine, this kind of problem solving, this kind of responsibility would require like a lot of different pieces to come together, right? Even from a developer's perspective, they need to understand, let's say, what the cloud does, how it integrates with the backend, how it needs to be shown to the users for the smoothest experience possible, and so on. And getting feedback from the users and trying to figure out the design of it as well, right? Now, it's not that they do not have any help with this. We make sure that there are people who can take ownership of larger pieces, with everything else aligning to ensure that they are enabled to do so, enabled to deliver on all of these values. So that's the kind of people that we look for, and the hiring process also sort of reflects this kind of requirement.
I remember transitioning from my second developer position to my third position. And the biggest change, and it bumped up my salary too, which obviously I loved, but the biggest change was ownership. It was true ownership, understanding the user. I was put in front of, like, I wasn't in a room talking to the user, but I was much more in touch with the feedback that we got for the product in my area, right? And any issues that came up with that, they came to me, and I had the autonomy to figure that out and solve that problem. I love the ownership piece. Now, with junior developers in mind, because I get this feeling like you probably, is it fair to say that you probably look for a little bit more experienced developers for your team?
We actually have all sorts of experience ranges. We actually do have about 30% of the team who are completely fresh grads, right? And that's sort of the interesting thing. So long as there is a little bit of curiosity and the first principles thinking and problem solving ability that they can bring to the table, and so long as we can trust them, trust the team to do the right thing, with the right kind of involvement, and making sure that there is some kind of guardrails put in place, right? And you'd be surprised at the kind of work that people can come up with, and that's basically what we optimize for as well. Like get really good, smart folks who are very ambitious, who are very hungry, and set them free, set them wild, right? And the results have been like really, really good so far. And again, this sort of goes back to the previous point that you mentioned, which is everything that they do needs to be centered around what the user wants. And that kind of orientation is essentially the guardrail that I'm talking about. We can chat more about that in a little bit.
Okay. You keep mentioning first principles thinking. What does that mean exactly? I'm
glad you asked. So there are a couple of different pieces to this, right? First principle thinking is specific to domains, and generally, let's say we talk about architecting a system, right? It could be a front end, it could be a back end, it could be a design system that we are creating as a part of a company, or it could just be a simple product that a simple feature in the product that we're building out. Now, the first principles thinking means essentially cutting through all the noise and getting to what the hard constraints are, and mapping that with what value we need to be delivering, and how to map these two in place, right? In the case of something like architecture, that would be how can we, with the simplest kind of design, solve our requirement, which is coming from our users, so that we can provide the best experience possible, right? Now, that would be the problem statement, and the kind of thinking that we'd require is, hey, like, should this interaction, if this interaction needs to be as realistic as possible, or as smooth as possible, or as fast as possible. Now, what is it that we can do from a design perspective to enable that? That could be, some kind of micro interaction feedback. It could be, which essentially travels through the stack in the form of, let's say, an asynchronous call, which gives a call back once some kind of larger processing is done, etc. Right? Now, it involves that kind of understanding of what the capabilities are, what the building blocks are, and how that can be mapped to the kind of problem that is being solved. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So when we talked last time, I'm just actually going to pull something from the outline. It felt like you prefer developers to have knowledge of the full stack. So what you're talking about is like, you basically, it sounds like you want some depth of knowledge to not just understand surface level pieces, but what the hell, is happening with that API call, and how does that essentially solve the user's problem in a reasonable and smooth way. But I remember you mentioned like full stack, you're kind of defining it like UX focused, user focused, because you even mentioned like how the role of a front-end developer can extend to be more full stack, not in the terms of back-end, but towards UX. So with like the front-end developers that you hire, do you feel like it's more beneficial to have more UX and design-oriented thinking, or is it very beneficial to have back-end experience as well?
So let me, I have like a lot of thoughts on this, and let me just set some context. So generally, as a company, as a team, communication is an n square problem, right? Like when you have n people working on a particular issue, then for every pairwise person to be in sync with each other, there are like n square handshakes required, right? Order n square. And that compounds very quickly, right? And something that is very like super efficient in terms of how a team can be structured is to essentially reduce these kind of overheads that exist. This has a couple of benefits in terms of like more ownership for engineers, less communication overhead, and less process overhead, more importantly. And overall, it's just a much better developer friendly environment for everyone to work in, right? So that's really where a lot of the stuff in terms of going more full stack, going broader and expanding horizons across the stack comes from, right? Now, and so that can essentially, and front-end engineers are in a very interesting and nice place where they can expand in both directions, right? They can go full stack in one direction, which is more towards design followed by the front end development, or it could be front end and back end development. So if you look at the commonalities, right, the communication involved is reduced. The ability to common skill sets exist in terms of both of these overlaps, right? The ability to code in the case of like a front end to back end full stack kind of expansion, and the ability to think from a user's perspective and design experiences which delight users from a front end to a design kind of perspective, right? So that's the expansion essentially that's the way I think about it when I say more full stack. Now with that as context, front end engineers also have this additional responsibility of translating everything, like all the pixel perfection that designers traditionally come up with, and they are the ones who actually create the product, right? They are the ones who craft it, and that output is essentially what is exposed to users, right? So they also have the huge responsibility of not just translating designs, but understanding the fact that designs as an output from a designer don't necessarily cover like all the minute edge cases, etc. Right? Like you have the representative designs, and you have some kind of detail, but specific error handling, etc. For instance, is something that the engineers understand a little better than the designers, right? And so it makes a lot of sense, and something that we find to be working really well again is that so long as that user empathy is built, and the front end folks who, in my experience, also tend to have an eye for design. If they're essentially trusted with the additional responsibility, then they can actually go a little more full stack, and that adds huge value in terms of just the pace at which people can deliver things, right? Again, helps in terms of reducing overheads and making sure that all the deliverables from one function to the other are seamlessly taken care of. In this case, it's basically them looking at both.
I like your mindset, or the reasoning behind hiring people with a little bit broader knowledge. I like the idea of reducing that communication, understanding. Well, I mean, like, essentially hiring more engineers doesn't necessarily solve the problem faster, and it can complicate things. And you understand that, especially when you have specializations within your engineering team. So what you're describing, I think you're going to find from a mid-level developer, but I'm going to challenge this a bit. With junior developers, I have mentored thousands, and I have found that many just don't really, they have a lot of surface level knowledge. There's so even like front end, a lot of people dive into React too quickly, and they don't truly know JavaScript, skip right over CSS, right? And they just try to learn what people tell them to learn, but there's so much depth with it. I mean, it took me years to even, I would claim, to become like get at an intermediate level with JavaScript. I went through the book You Don't Know JS, and then I expanded from there. And like, I started to understand it more, but it took a long time, especially with JavaScript being a quirky language. So with a junior developer, let's even say like entry level, they're fresh in the industry. There's a lot to learn if they hear from you. Like, it really is going to benefit them to be more user-centered focused, be more design-oriented, and like kind of understand what's happening with the back end, like try to aim for that full stack developer. Now I can almost see that knowledge like really getting spread thin. So if you had to be picky and really you had like 20, 30 choices, let's say like all were a good cultural fit, but they had different technical knowledge, like for your front end positions, would you prefer them to be more UX oriented, or would you prefer them to be full stack in terms of understanding more the back end?
So I think the kind of developers that you're talking about are essentially the the T-shaped ones, right? Where there is a slightly deeper understanding in specific parts, and they have the ability to expand beyond that. Now, that's ideal. However, inclination towards that is what I would be looking for. So if it's like a very a beginner, then I would say focus on getting the basics right. That sort of adds to the whole first principles thinking. It gets them to understand the fundamentals of what is being done, why things are being done in a particular manner, and understanding the core of computer science in a way, right? Essentially, the ability to go n levels deep and cut through the abstractions to truly understand how let's say a particular design choice would mean, or how a particular function call would reflect across all the different layers that it traverses through, etc. Right? So that kind of an understanding is going to be extremely important, and the advice on top of that I would add is just make sure that you're always curious and always learning, because this is a very vast kind of area, right? Now, when both of these are married together, essentially basic understanding of a particular area, it's a great start, right? I would not expect everyone in the industry to be able to span across all of these, and there's also a good value to specialization, right? Now, what I would say is just make sure that you're good at one thing that you do, and then try to expand out further without spreading yourself too thin, because jack of all trades is not really something that would add as much value as being really good at one and then having the ability to leverage that point of strength and go more full stack, as we're calling it.
Okay. So if I understand you correctly, you're really looking for, it sounds like you're really looking for someone who has some depth of knowledge but has an inclination towards expanding that knowledge into a broader area potentially, and that's kind of what makes them unique. Now, I'm going to challenge this again, because I think you mostly answered my question, but if you had to tell a brand new developer it's going to be more beneficial to truly understand like accessibility and UX and kind of the psychology of the user and develop a user-centered mindset and like really dive deeper into UX, or they could, if they could basically dive a little bit deeper into backend, do you think there's actually a preference that you find that you have of the expansion in either direction where you would more seriously consider that candidate?
So again, with my startup hat on, as a founder of a startup, and with all the constraints that it brings to the table, right, including ruthless prioritization and efficiency that we need to be bringing in to essentially the entire team, that from that perspective, I would definitely prefer someone who has both front end and back end capabilities in one person, so that I can essentially I can essentially work with one person instead of two different people to deliver on each particular feature. Now, across 10 people, let's say we have like a split of, let's say some people on the back end, some people on the front end. The net output could be similar, but in terms of a preference for hiring, it would definitely be more towards someone who is broader in scope there, because the workloads, the prioritization, etc., also keeps changing every few months, right? So from all of those perspectives, from purely a requirement perspective, it would be just a lot more convenient and a lot more desirable to have someone who can span across different disciplines.
Okay. I appreciate you elaborating on that.
Yeah. And the same thing holds true for the other side towards design as well. And again, in terms of our company, it's sort of unique. The domain basically being dev tools, because our users are other engineers just like the people who are building the product. So that's sort of where the whole loop ties itself together in our case very conveniently, because the people who are building the product, the developers, are the people who are exactly like the people who are going to be using the product. And in fact, we use our product to essentially deploy our product and so on, right? So that's the kind of that has some loops of built-in user understanding and empathy, etc., and makes it very convenient for folks to understand what our users want.
That makes sense. Yeah. So yeah, your engineers truly are the users, and they can empathize with other users that are going to use your dev tools. That makes a lot of sense. I feel like, okay, so there's a big struggle with new software engineers where it's almost like I think traditional education has trained a lot of people to just study and learn through memorization and not practical application, right? And I think a computer science degree can give some exposure over many, many years, but I still find people coming out of computer science degrees that need to spend a little bit of time after that applying it, and especially refreshing with more marketable technologies where they have more of a solid foundation. So with a focus on kind of just like pivoting and how to like truly grow as a software engineer, it's my personal belief you learn by doing it. Like just simplify it to that. And I feel like a lot of people are just so stuck in this traditional mindset where they're just like, tell me what to learn, tell me what to build, tell me to do this, and I'll learn the technical details on how to do that. And I know this is kind of like a off question, but what advice would you give to like new developers to start training yourself to basically become like problem solvers and use the tools that they're picking up to be able to solve those problems? Do you find there's like certain strategies they can implement to start transitioning into someone that is going to be more user-centered, is going to like want to understand this, and is going to apply their understanding of how people are going to use a product to how they're learning?
Yeah. So I think, this is something that we think about all the time. And for that reason, our hiring process, etc., also is designed to sort of reflect that, right? And I think it's also a little unique in its own way, the kind of process that we follow here at Argonaut. Now, I'm happy to go into that also if that's something that is interesting to folks. But I think the broader picture here is that you're absolutely right. Understanding something in theory is very different, especially in the computer science domain, from actually putting it in practice and taking it from an understanding from your CLRS, the Corman Introduction to the Algorithms book, to actually just building a particular application. It could be a chat app, or it could be a Netflix clone or whatever, right? But even that is very different from what you would be learning in theory. So while it is, I would say it is important to understand all of those basics, the true value that a majority of the industry gets out of software engineers. There are obviously going to be some niches which leverage very deep technical skills and theory specifically when you're dealing with, let's say, something like a distributed systems or large scale optimization kind of problems, or machine learning, etc. For a majority of the application development kind of workloads, and this I believe constitutes like 80-90% of the industry, what is actually most useful is to just pick a problem and start working on it, right? And it's also hard to just come up with some random idea and pull it through to the end. So an easier first step would be to actually look at a lot of the open source projects who have good first issues, right? They're very open to contributors, and they're also happy to engage with with potential developers, etc. That I think is a very nice funnel, which does two things, right? One, it enables you to work in a real life situation on a real life project that someone is building a company on top of, etc. Right? So that's great. It gives the new developer a chance to understand processes, etc., and best practices. And on the other hand, it also gives them a lot of recognition in terms of cred, essentially, right? Me putting together, let's say, a Netflix clone on my personal website is not as effective in making a statement to others as saying, hey, I contributed to this particular open source project, right? So both of them have that marketable value, and they also are very beneficial in actually just learning by doing. So I think that would be the best way to go about it for most engineers who are just starting off on their programming journey.
Interesting. Okay. So you identified something with a lot of new engineers where they don't really know what to build. And that's a question that often comes up. And so what you're recommending is, okay, well, maybe you don't really need to identify a problem just yet. So let's go to open source. Let's go ahead and pick out an issue that exists. Let's solve that problem. I love that idea when people are truly stuck and kind of just treading water, and they don't, and contributing to open source and even pulling down a code base, getting it running locally, like that's good experience. I like that idea for starting out. Now I want to hear your opinion on this. I hosted a mentorship meetup in Chicago. We had about like 10 to 30 people that would show up each night we did it. And there was one woman who was fascinated with contributing to Mozilla, and she just wanted to contribute to Firefox. And it was really interesting. I watched her work, but every day I'm like, okay, this is really cool. I'm just curious, have you paired it with project work? Have you built your own project, right? I think you're actually pretty capable of it. And she's like, no, not yet. I don't know what to build. And so she'd continue contributing. And it got to the point where I felt like she just, even with that type of project, she just wasn't growing a whole lot. I don't know if it's because she couldn't pick up more complex issues, and she got experience with contributing to a more complex code base. But I get just from what people have shared with me, sometimes you kind of get stuck with fixing small issues with open source projects, and you don't really get to dive into the meat of things. And open source projects have like core contributors that are going to tackle the hard, difficult problems. So do you feel like you can find open source projects where you can continue diving deeper and deeper and deeper and solving like really big problems? Or do you think open source is more of a supplement to personal projects?
So since the conversation was about, how do you get started? I brought up this kind of mechanism, and I think it's a good starting point, but it's also not for everyone, right? Because at the end of the day, like you mentioned, there are going to be core contributors, and they're probably doing that as their day job, right? So if there's only so much time that you can, let's say only maybe a weekend or two that you can spend on it, then you probably won't be able to take up really large tasks, especially if they're critical tasks, right? So you will be taking up like second order tasks, etc., which may or may not be as interesting. Now, this is basically a good starting point, especially when, to get your feet wet and to just get over the initial barrier of, hey, what do I build, where do I get started, and actually start doing something. But I would, I incline to agree with you that in most cases you're going to be hitting a limit. Right. There are cases where you will be essentially where you can essentially push through, dedicate more time to it, etc. Pick up more interesting issues, work very closely with the core maintainers, and potentially even start working full time for the open source project or the foundation or whatever. Right. There are people who have done that, but that would be a minority. And I would say, get started with something like this. It'll probably get you going with the best practices, etc. And then, maybe you can take up and probably along the way, you'll also have more exposure to think of specific projects, etc., that you would be wanting to work on, and then take it up from there, push it forward.
I like that. I like the idea of those types of problems giving you more exposure to give you just more to work with to solve your own problems or come up with something like that.
You're just you're just exposed to actual problems that exist, and for all you might actually have a way of solving a particular pain point in a very cool way. Maybe it's not possible to do it in the scope of that particular project, but that's a problem. So you can potentially go ahead and create your own project around solving for that pain point, right? And that's how a lot of nice companies are born.
Interesting. So I'm going to ask one more question about this because I think this is interesting. You mentioned it kind of gives you cred, and it sounds like it's something that might catch your attention when you look on a resume and see that potentially, but there has to be like a difference between listing certain types of contributions with open source that aren't as impressive and that actually are worth the time and are impressive, like on a resume, like that's how they present themselves and stand out. What's a way, or what's a specific way or type of project that someone can contribute to a certain depth where you're just like, wow, they stand out with this?
Right. So two thoughts come to mind. The first is that the benefit that the reason for open source projects adding cred is because that sort of guarantees exposure to some best practices, both in terms of processes and in terms of how to actually build code, run code, etc. Right? Especially as a part of a team, as opposed to just soloing it as one person, right? So that is one reason why, especially for beginners, having something like that adds value. And secondly, the specific contribution would be obviously important, especially from the perspective of relevance, right? So if, let's say, there is a particular project and the kind of issues that the new developer that we're talking about has solved for are completely on, let's say, accessibility, right? And maybe that is not a problem at all, or not a focus area of choice for the particular company that is working on this. Maybe it's a very different domain. Maybe their audience is very specific, etc. Right? So in that case, there's a mismatch in terms of relevance, and obviously that would act as a filtering. That might not carry as much weight as something that is very relevant to the kind of problem that a potential employer is also looking for, right? So I would say that would be the second criteria, which adds. Which potentially can add more impact, especially if there is alignment in terms of the kind of problems that you've been exposed to, right? If, let's say, someone has been contributing to Mozilla, and let's say the Chrome team is looking at hiring, then might actually be a decent fit, especially if they have a position for a junior developer, right? So that's the kind of additional value that something like a first contributing a little bit to open source could bring to the table.
Makes a lot of sense. Yeah, if the domains match, that's more relevant, and it makes you like really stand out. Okay.
Right. And the other part with open source projects is that, there are usually closed source equivalents also, which means, or basically a couple of adjacent projects, which means that there is going to be a little bit of a match if you're working on that kind of a problem.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I like that. I'm going to think more about that because my advice tends to not lean on contributing to open source, but I think people don't have this mindset to connect, because I love this advice, but connect your problem that you solve with this specific tool or open source to the company that you want to hire. You do stand out, and a lot of people are just, spitting out the resume to 500 companies hoping for the best. So I like that advice. I think it's good advice.
Interestingly, like we actually just last week brought an engineer onto the team, a fresh grad, just right out of college, and has contributed to a couple of open source projects before, and that's sort of worked out because they sort of knew what they were getting into in terms of like broader domain processes, working with a broader team, etc. And they could wrap their head around the kind of problems, etc., that we would be facing as a company, and also that experience carried through nicely into the interviews, and we ended up hiring them.
That's awesome. I think it's such a good strategy. Like, that's why I think it's really important to, like you said, get curious. Like, why do you care about coding? Like, what kind of problems do you want to solve? What do you want to build? I feel like just trying to figure that out by trying things too, because I think sometimes people don't give themselves that exposure. They go through this like very linear tutorial, follow along over and over and over, then they go to the next tutorial. How the hell do you know what you enjoy working on?
Absolutely. And sorry,
go for it.
There's something that I really came to mind when you were talking about this. So there's this person, Kelsey Hightower, who works in the Kubernetes space, has been working with Google, and he's just known for being a very curious and very humane kind of person, right? Very humble, amazingly helpful to the entire community. And it's fresh in my mind because they just retired from Google after working there for 20 years or so. And they started off as a data center technician and grew to a fairly high level in Google. And within 20 years, they could essentially get themselves to a point where they're financially comfortable enough that they could retire. And, they were essentially lauded by everyone, including their CEO, on their retirement, right? So, and this is something that he says, which is just make sure that you're curious and you can build those kind of skills, build the technical skills along the way. Just make sure that you're curious and you always keep learning, right? I think that's a wonderful way to approach the whole thing.
Yeah, that's the key. That's the mindset to a lot of successful developers. And the trick is shifting people's mindset to that. It's like, I think it just goes back to being trained with traditional education and tell me what to learn, rather than like, I don't want to get too out of bounds, but I feel like, traditional education just teaches us to be a bunch of workers who don't really think creatively. And I think that's trouble in different pieces of our education. But I love the idea. It's just like, I feel like people just need to figure out what you want to build. And then you could supplement. You can look up articles, you can look up videos, you can experiment, you can go through a tutorial. But yeah, it's essentially what I would like to encourage people to do.
Absolutely. And it's more about, you know, what's the problem? What's the problem that is being solved? Just understanding that, again, ties back to the user-centered thinking that you're talking about, right? What's the problem being solved? What is the best way in which we can alleviate that problem for our users? And the rest of the technology is essentially a means to solving that problem for that particular person, right? That person could be you. That person could be, someone in the family. That person could be a company or a multi-billion-dollar firm, right? Whatever it is, it just trying to figure that out and working backwards from there. The rest of the pieces can fall into place. Let's say, the user, the understanding of what the user wants is clear. Then you can go back and say, hey, like, this is how I need to structure my technology. This is how I need to structure all the different pieces so that I can solve that problem in the right manner, right? As opposed to, saying, hey, like, these are pieces I have, or I know how to do a linked list, and I'm going to put it into my to-do app that I'm building, which probably will not work very well, right? So it's basically going back from the problem and trying to figure out how best to solve for it. And that's where I think the curiosity piece also comes in, which is in the process of figuring out how best to solve it, you'd be looking around. You'd try to get to the best possible way, and that involves understanding more about the technology itself and potentially pushing the boundaries there, right? To get to that solution.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I love that mindset. I hope people will listen to that. Just like really rewind and listen to that, because these are the types of software engineers that I just see get hired over and over and over. And it's just very curious software engineers, and it's just coming into it with, that mindset of like, as long as I'm user centered and I want to try to identify problems and solve it, the technology comes afterwards. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I feel like I've asked all my questions. Is there anything else that you want to add?
No, just stay curious. I guess Steve Jobs said it better: stay hungry, stay foolish, right? And if you're curious about what I do, I'd be happy to chat. You can find me at my handle on Twitter and LinkedIn is Surya Oruganti. That's SURYAORUGANTI. And you can check out what we're building at Argonaut.dev, which is ARGONAUT.dev. And I'm always happy for chatting up.
Sounds good. Just curious, as of now, are you guys currently hiring?
We actually just closed our hiring for this quarter, at least, with last week's hire.
Well, congrats. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Okay.
We'll probably get back into hiring mode in a few months.
Okay, that sounds great. Seriously, hopefully this was helpful. I'm very curious what you guys think, especially with the open source stuff, especially with the mindset stuff. If you're watching on YouTube, just talk about it in the comments. Like, if you disagree, agree, what have you heard elsewhere? I'm very curious. I'm really developing the right mindset to be a strong developer, but also be a hireable developer. So feel free to leave your comments below. But Surya or Surya?
The farmer.
Okay. Surya, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate your time. I'm glad we finally got to do this. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.